Good morning, everybody. Alrighty, we'll give it a few minutes because actually we're only missing about 3 people. Not too bad, but I'll go ahead and take attendance and see who else shows up while I do that. And I know some people had sporting events change because there's supposed to be weather tomorrow. So we might have some people out for that because they're traveling. Okay, well, I've got everybody who's here. Okay, so hopefully everybody got my email yesterday. Yeah, the syllabus said that today was the 29th. I guess I was just off on my number when I did it. So apologies on that. Yes, your media papers are due today. And what you do is just put everything in one document. At one point in the syllabus, it says you're going to turn it in 2 ways. That's from when I do this in person. I usually have people turn in a hard copy just because it's easier to put everything together. But you should be able to just put everything in one Word document or stitch it into a PDF fairly easily. Just copy paste stuff into the Word document. Just because Blackboard will only accept one document per assignment. So just make sure you've got it all in one place. So again, I am taking attendance, or I am, sorry, taking things late. I'm also taking attendance for people who are coming in. So if you do need to turn it in late, you don't even have to email me, just turn it in late. I do ask that you have everything into me by our last day of class, which, believe it or not, I believe is about a month from today, which is a little mind-boggling. Just because once we get to the exam, I only have 48 hours to grade everything and submit it. So if you can give me more time to do that, that would be fantastic. Gentle reminder to make sure you're doing the Launchpad stuff on Blackboard. If for some reason it's not showing, Launchpad stuff you can connect through Blackboard, but through the Launchpad site, if for some reason your grades aren't showing up in Blackboard, I've had at least one person, I've straightened it out on my end, but some people it just didn't connect right. So let me know if you've been doing it, but it's not showing up on our Blackboard page, and I will fix that for you. Other than that, coming up, actually, let me open the syllabus because I'm not remembering off the top of my head the date of our next exam. It's in a little bit. But I mean, it's kind of like gonna coast downhill from here. All right, so exam 3 is 2 weeks from today. It is on, now let me make sure this date is right. Yes, it's on the 13th of April. That's a correct date. And so that'll cover the dissociative and somatoform disorders, the eating disorders. Next class, we'll talk about the sexual disorders and gender variations, and then schizophrenia. So that'll be the material covered on this particular exam. Any questions about anything coming up? And feel free to either unmute or stick it in the chat. The other thing you should be thinking about is by Thursday the 15th, which again is only in a couple weeks, your group should meet with me. So what you should do is get together as a group and figure out times that work for you, and then assign one person to go into my Calendly and sign up for an appointment for the whole group. And then we'll just all get on either the Google Meet or the Zoom call and chat. You need to have your outline done by that time, because what I do is I give you feedback and say, like, ooh, you're trying to put way too much in here, or, ooh, in this area, you could flesh this out a little bit, things like that. And that has really helped groups in the past. Alrighty, so I'm not seeing any questions. So I am going to get our lecture pulled up here and ready to screen share and all that good stuff. And actually, just because it's working right now, I think I'm going to start with a video. So we watched a video last Thursday about someone with anorexia nervosa. This one I am going to show you all is about someone with bulimia nervosa. So you'll hear her describing what a binge is like. And just, you know, from the perspective of someone who has worked with people clinically in the past, I have treated people with eating disorders. It is so important as an eating disorder therapist, good morning, Simba, to make sure that you are non-judgmental when a client is telling you this. They could tell you they ate stuff out of the trash can and you can't be like, ew. You have to be like, okay. And just roll with it and help them realize, like, yeah, it's not good that you're doing that, right? But at the same token, I'm not going to react in a completely negative way. I'm just going to try to help you, essentially. So let me look over my lovely cat and screen share the video. Let me find the thing where it says optimize the video clip. There we go. Okay. And I'll go ahead and play it.
The food, I want it so bad. But once I have it, I have no control over it. It's like the food has total control over me. And it's just coming at me. And I really feel that I cannot stop it. And so then I've lost control. Control to me is not binging. That's control. And I've lost control once I start that binge. Okay, this was a binge last Friday, and it consisted of a loaf of bread and butter. It has to be real butter. A big dinner plate of now this is food from work, so this is I'm describing the food that was available to me at that time. A big plate of scrambled eggs and hash browns. I mean a big plate. And a loaf of bread and butter. A pound of butter, not you know, a couple dabs. I like a lot of butter on my bread, a ton of butter on my bread. In fact, people at work, they don't know I have an eating disorder, but if I'm in that mode and they see me, they'll go, oh my gosh, how can you eat that much butter on a teeny piece of bread? So, I mean, it's an unusual amount that people take notice of it. About 8 pieces of French toast, about 4 muffins, about 5 Danishes, and then by that time I'm kind of feeling a little bit sick, but at the end of a binge I like to end it with chocolate or sweets. After I purge, I feel, well, I feel like, oh, thank God I could get this all out. That, I mean, that's a big concern for me, that I can't get all of my food out. And then I start thinking, well, some of the food has stayed in me, and so I try and figure out how much has stayed in me. So then I can kind of figure out how much I can eat the rest of the day.
Okay, so that gives you a better feeling, I think, of what a binge is like for someone who binges. And so you see it's a lot of calories. And as I mentioned last Thursday, it is a lot of things that, you know, just sort of evolutionarily we might have craved. So things like carbs and fats, right? So a whole loaf of bread plus butter on top. And so there are, you know, again, these I don't even know how to describe it because I've never experienced it. But essentially, it is like a feeling of being out of control. It is a feeling of uh, feeling like you have to do this. You kind of said that at the end. Then I feel like I can go about my day, right? So it's almost like they feel like someone else is controlling it, like they recognize that's not the case. But it is very much the disorder controls them and not the other way around. And so I think that's something that with eating disorders and with some other things like substance abuse, we don't really understand or do well with as a society. We don't really reflect that this is a disease, right? And so we can't tell someone who's binging and purging, just stop it, right? We can't tell someone with anorexia nervosa, just eat, right? That's never going to work. It's like telling someone with COVID, just get out of bed and you'll be fine, right? Just don't have a fever, right? So I think that's a really important piece of this to understand. Unfortunately, in pop culture, eating disorders have been the brunt of jokes sometimes, and that is really unfortunate because, as we talked about Thursday, particularly anorexia nervosa is the most deadly of any of the psychiatric illnesses. So again, people can have anywhere from 1 to 40 binges per week. They are carried out in secret. They will often sort of plan them. They might do them in their car and then dispose of the wrappers in a dumpster somewhere to hide the evidence. And they're consuming a lot of calories. They feel helpless. They feel powerlessness. They feel tension. There's often feelings of anxiety, stress, depression before they start these things. And then the binge itself might be pleasurable, just like when you're binge drinking, right? It might be really fun. But afterwards, they tend to feel this extreme self-blame, guilt, depression, and fears of weight gain or of other people discovering them. Now, one thing I will say as a side note is these are usually very, again, like personal and hidden things, but occasionally there will be groups that get into this together. So I had a client in grad school who said, everyone I know has an eating disorder. And they would like go and all purge together. And there are certainly stories of sororities doing that, or girls who attend dance schools, things along that. There are horror stories about ballet schools having to replace their plumbing because all the stomach acid corroded it. So obviously, this can be a really big issue, especially in certain populations, and we'll talk about that later in this PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so the compensatory behaviors. These are similar to the ones we talked about for anorexia, only these are much more defining for these individuals. So after a binge, people will try to compensate for or undo the caloric effects. You heard that in the video where the woman was talking like, I feel like I didn't get it all out, right? So the most common compensatory behaviors, the one we tend to think of is vomiting. One side note about vomiting is that it actually fails to present the absorption of about half the calories consumed during a binge. And vomiting consistently, or more often than occasionally when you're sick, actually affects your ability to feel satiated. It leads to greater hunger and binging, actually, because it just sort of throws your whole system off. Vomiting also puts a lot of stress on the body. So in addition to, we mentioned tooth decay last time, we mentioned, ulcers of the esophagus. Sometimes they'll have like burst blood vessels around their eyes from vomiting. I don't know if people remember this case. I believe this happened while I was in grad school, but there was a case of a woman, I'm not going to remember her name, but she was in a coma and she was on a feeding tube and she was brain dead. And the only thing keeping her alive was a feeding tube. And her family was trying to like get her off the feeding tube. And like Bush 2 was president, W was president then, and he was like fighting against it. And a piece of that story that didn't really get reported on that often was that she had the stroke that put her in that vegetative state in the middle of vomiting because she had bulimia nervosa. So clearly, some other risk factors associated with this as well. Laxatives are pills that essentially flush everything out of your stomach and intestines. If you've ever had to have a colonoscopy, they make you take laxatives beforehand. And diuretics are water pills. And so they're supposed to help you like lose water weight. And that's all they do is help you lose water weight. These also almost completely fail to reduce the number of calories consumed. And then ones we don't think of. So fasting. I think I mentioned Tuesday, or last Thursday rather, that I had a client who would just try to see how long in the day she could go before she would eat. So she would get up at 7 or so and not eat until 3 p.m. This is why I and a lot of members of the Eating Disorder and Body Image Research Committee are very, very skeptical about intermittent fasting and similar fad diets. If you're fasting for religious purposes, that's completely different, right? But essentially you're encouraging disordered eating behavior, and for some people it might be fine, but for other people it will start them down this destructive path. Also,
sorry. I was reading an article the other day about intermittent fasting and gender and how it's been praised in men, particularly executives and people like that, saying that they're doing it for productivity and it helps them work better. But when we see people like, I don't know, Gwyneth Paltrow saying she ate like 300 calories a day, it was frowned upon because we're all aware of, eating disorders in women, but then we see it in men, and because we're not as aware that can happen, it's like, wow, that's amazing. He's, being more productive and it's helping him, and we see it as a positive thing, but it's pretty much the same.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Romina. Yeah, and like maybe for a day or so, fasting will help you, like sharpen your attention because you're hungry, right? And so you're like, oh, but actually over time, people who lose a lot of weight or don't eat have problems with memory, have problems with focus, things along those lines. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, that we tend to miss eating disorders in men. And in fact, as I mentioned Thursday, even like the official statistics in the DSM say, 90% of people with eating disorders are women, when in fact, most recent statistics actually say about 40% of those with eating disorders are men, not 10. So yeah, we miss these in men a lot, and that's really scary. And obviously, anytime you're going to make any kind of dietary or exercise change, you should consult with your physician. Perhaps consult with a dietitian. When I had gestational diabetes, I worked with a dietitian, and it was really, really helpful. So I think that there are, sort of pros and cons to everything. And depending on your body and what's going on with it, different things might work for you, right? But you should only do that under the supervision of a medical professional who knows all of your medical issues. That's sort of my disclaimer. So excessive exercise, we would see these folks, the rec center at Kent State, where I went to grad school, was gorgeous, huge, tons of cardio machines, but it was very busy because it was 25,000 students on campus. So you had to sign up for the cardio machines, and you could unfortunately tell the women with eating disorders because they would just sign up for different machines in a row and be there for hours just switching machines. Heartbreaking, right? Because, you're not allowed to just approach someone as a therapist and be like, let me therapize you, right? Because you don't know. They could have been athletes in training, right? But it's difficult, right? And compensatory behaviors may temporarily relieve those negative feelings that are associated with the binge. You feel like you've got some of this out. Oh, cool, there's a wasp in my house. Wonder how that happened. Lovely. I'm just gonna ignore it and hope that it ignores me, and we're gonna just roll with it. the joys of working from home. But over time, a cycle will develop where, you will maybe fast. And then, as we mentioned the other day, you just get hungry, right? In addition to all the emotional things. So then you'll binge, and then you feel awful about binging. So then you'll try to compensate by maybe vomiting or excessive exercise. And it just becomes this horrible self-perpetuating cycle. So how are bulimia and anorexia similar and different? Both often onset after a period of dieting, and particularly if you're getting positive reinforcement from other people in your life about it. Oh, have you lost weight? You look so good. It's like, right, if you have humor, it's like, so I didn't look good before, right? But a lot of the folks who do develop eating disorders, that just sets them down a course. One of my clients described this exact thing to me, where she had lost like 5 pounds, and people said, you look so great. So then she was like, well, what if I lost another 5 pounds? And what if I lost another 10 pounds? And what if I lost 30 pounds, right? They have this fear of becoming obese, and they have a skewed idea of what is obese, right? So for someone particularly with an eating disorder, being in the quote unquote normal BMI range might make them think they're obese, right? When in fact it's 2 ranges above that. They have a drive to become thin. They're preoccupied with food, weight, their appearance. The preoccupation with food is really interesting. If anyone's done the clinical choices on this yet, you see that a little bit in that case where she like makes food for everybody else and then doesn't eat it. Clients do this a lot. They'll like watch, Food Network and like make recipes, but not eat them themselves. I had a client with bulimia bring me banana bread once. That was fun to process, right? Okay, what's going on here, right? Elevated risk of self-harm or attempts at suicide. We tend to see with both of these disorders, they do tend to coincide or be comorbid with mood disorders, anxiety disorders, some of the personality disorders as well. Some of these clients will describe this is like a cry for help or self-punishment, either starving themselves or binging and purging. And one of actually the client who made me banana bread told me once, I know I'm slowly killing myself, and I'm seeing if anyone will notice. So just heart writing. So I mentioned anxiety and depression. Also, perfectionism is a huge issue here. This is actually something I have a publication about with my colleague Danielle Riptolfi. Substance abuse, so binge eating, binge drinking tend to go together. For anorexia, I don't know if you see it as much anymore, but it used to be in the 90s. There was like this heroin chic, and people would essentially eat or take heroin because it is partially an appetite suppressant. Most stimulants are, or they'd smoke for the same reason. And then just really disturbed attitudes towards eating, like seeing eating as harmful rather than fuel for your body.
Is there any correlation between this and like family income growing up? I asked because I had a health class one time, and they talked about how, lower income people from lower income families tend to try to find some type of peace or resolution in other places. So like if we brought up like the drug part, is there like a correlation between that, even as far as eating disorders, like trying to fit a perfect image because other things in life are going wrong?
That is a really good question, Charleston, and that's actually a question we're still figuring out research-wise right now. So for years, these disorders were branded as disorders of like rich white girls. And surprise, surprise, when we do more research, we find out they are actually common in women of color, particularly in certain communities. In fact, Asian American women have higher rates than white women. And for years, again, they thought like this was not like, again, only like middle class and upper class women would have this. But in fact, one of my colleagues, Carolyn Becker, and there's several other research groups that have started to look into this, is now looking at this with food insecurity. So people who, might not be able to put food on the table every day. And they actually sometimes do develop disordered eating behavior as part of that, sort of like binging and purging as a way to cope. And maybe that shouldn't surprise us, because back in, I believe, the 40s, there was an army study where volunteers, they didn't just do it to people, but volunteers signed up and they essentially put them on the type of diet someone with anorexia would have, not because they were studying eating disorders, but because they wanted to see what are the effects of starvation on the body. And they developed a lot of habits that look like eating disorders, like they would hoard their food and binge and purge. But yeah, it's entirely possible that if you are someone, particularly, let's say you're someone who is in a scenario where you are, let's say, attending a middle class high school or an upper class high school, and you yourself are from, you know, a not great neighborhood, or, you know, lower class, working class family, it's entirely possible this might be a type of way to try to control. Yeah, that element of it, I think, is really important, because particularly in adolescent girls, one of the things we see, although adolescent boys who develop this too, and non-binary people, I'm assuming too, although I haven't seen the research on that yet. But one of the things that happens is that they will feel like they can't control anything in their lives. And so they feel like this is the one thing they control. They'll refuse to eat, right? And of course, the irony, as we've been talking about, is that they're not in control of it, right? The disorder's in control of them. But yeah, that perfectionism and that element of control could come into play there. Plus, again, if you are from a family that is, you know, food insecure, some of these things can develop just because of raw hunger. And we know that our society is not nice to anyone who's in minority status, right? So anyone who is of low socioeconomic status, people of color, people who are overweight or obese, right? And so people tend to judge those folks. And that judgment, we know, can also sort of get in your head. The other problem with people who are food insecure or live in working class neighborhoods is a lot of times they're in what are called food deserts. And so food deserts are when you only have access to convenience stores. There are no grocery stores within walking distance. To get to a grocery store, you have to either drive, but you might not have access to a car, right? Or take public transit, which may be unreliable. So they are having to do some of their grocery shopping at like 7-Eleven. Well, you can't get a ton of fresh produce at 7-Eleven, right? So that's another factor that plays into this as well. The other piece of this that I feel like I should acknowledge is that a lot of people will blame being poor or being Black or another person of color for the health disparities that we tend to see among those groups. Like, people will say, oh, people of color have higher levels of diabetes, and it's because their diet, and blah, 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 blah. Number one, how are you going to blame that for them when they live in food deserts? Number two, we're learning more and more those things are genetic, right? So they can't control it. Number three, and the biggest one, is that they do not have equal access to healthcare, and that is the biggest issue, right? So if you don't have health insurance, if the only free clinic in your area always has a 5-hour wait, right? If when you go to a doctor, even if you have insurance, they refuse to believe you and diagnose you with everything because you're quote unquote fat, right? And this happens to women and people of color much more often. Then you are more likely to suffer long-term complications. There are cases where people's cancer diagnoses were delayed because the doctors didn't think to check because the person was poor or a person of color or overweight or a woman. So yeah, that was a big sort of, feels like a sidebar, but it's not, right? Because all these things are intersecting. And that's really important to keep in mind, is that there are a lot of things that go into any of these diagnoses we talk about, right? And I think eating disorders are just a really nice example of that, because everyone has to eat, right? And it's not like substance abuse where, you know, one of the philosophies is that you just stop everything cold turkey. You can't stop eating cold turkey, right? And food also has a lot of cultural issues around it, right? Access to food is very class-based. Like people are like, why aren't these folks just buying organic vegetables? It's like, because it's double the price for the same damn thing. And in fact, organic vegetables often have more pesticides. They're just different pesticides. Anyway, that's another sidebar. But yes, great question. Thank you for getting me on intersectionality, Charleston. I really appreciate it. Any follow-ups to that from anybody?
I love your answer too.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, a book that several people J-term class talked about that I want to get, that it's called Not All Black Girls Know How to Eat, that addresses some of this. So. And we haven't even gotten to other psychological issues, right? So we've mentioned that they might have depression, anxiety, things like that. Trauma is another one. So if you are sexually assaulted, if you are sexually abused, it often creates a very strange relationship with your own body. And so unfortunately, I don't know percentages, but a good chunk, maybe at least 25% of the women I saw with eating disorders, it was partially because of sexual abuse or sexual assault. So yeah, all tied up. Okay, so some differences here. So people with bulimia are more worried about pleasing others. People with anorexia, it's like they can't think about others because their world becomes so small around food. People with bulimia tend to be more sexually experienced. I wonder how much of this is the fact that if you are losing so much weight in anorexia, you either never go through puberty or you might sort of put yourself back pre-pubertal, right? So that could be a part of it. Anorexia feels like OCD. There's a lot of the same sort of tendencies, those obsessive qualities, especially in that restricting type. People with bulimia have more mood swings, poor coping skills, tend to be controlled by emotion. As I was just mentioning, more likely to be display characteristics of a personality disorder. And then they have different medical complications. So again, if you don't have birth control as a factor, almost all women with anorexia nervosa lose their period. That's what amenorrhea means. You stop menstruating. But only about half of people with bulimia. But like I said, now that we have birth control and that gives you a period, it's not quite the same, right? Every month, we don't see this fluctuation. Obviously, this also doesn't take into account, you know, certain non-binary and male individuals with these as well. And people who do purge, again, we tend to see this more in bulimia, but some people with anorexia do have it as well, suffer that damage caused by purging. All right, so then there's binge eating disorder. And this is really interesting for me from my perspective, because when I was in grad school, was before the DSM-3 came out. I got my PhD in 2010, or the DSM-5, sorry, came out. Got my PhD in 2010, DSM-5 came out in 2013. We were already diagnosing people with this. There wasn't an official code, but you could diagnose them with eating disorder not otherwise specified, binge eating disorder. But when this came out, when the DSM-5 came out, people who have no experience in the realm of eating disorders were like, you're just giving a diagnosis so fat people can get away with it. And that's not what this is at all. This is a pathology. It involves recurrent binges and lack of control. So it's essentially bulimia nervosa without the compensatory behaviors, but everything psychologically is the same. So they do usually still have distress. They often have strange relationships with their body. One woman I treated with this was someone who was a survivor of sexual abuse as a kid. And she said she put on the weight. And one of the reasons she started binge eating was to protect herself, because she thought if she had all this weight around her, she wouldn't be attractive to abusers anymore. So you have these recurrent episodes of binge eating. I actually really like the way they describe binge eating in the DSM-5 here. I wish they had copy and paste this to bulimia because it applies there too, to be honest. So you have to have 3 of these symptoms, so rapid eating, large amounts without hunger, eating until you're uncomfortably full, eating alone because of embarrassment, and then feelings of self-disgust, depression, or guilt afterwards. Again, those all apply to binge eating, regardless of what disorder it occurs in. There's distress around the binge eating, and it has to be at least once a week, just like with bulimia nervosa. And again, there's no compensatory behavior. And so there are people with binge eating disorder who can be sort of normal weight or maybe just overweight. And there are people with binge eating disorder who are morbidly obese. It goes both ways. All right, so here is where we really start to get some interesting information about these disorders. So community samples, when we look at just sort of the general population, about 1 to 2% of people would meet criteria for binge eating disorder. But then we start to look at more specific samples. So people who are involved in Jenny Craig's weight loss program, 15% of them are binge eating disorder sufferers. People who go to weight loss clinics on universities. So these are clinics that train people how to help people lose weight, essentially. 30% of those folks have this. There is something called Overeaters Anonymous that tries to use the same model as like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. In my opinion, it works for some people, but most people, it just perpetuates their eating pathology. It's all about like getting rid of refined sugars and things that necessarily map onto medical knowledge, we'll put it that way. But 70% of those people are people with binge eating disorder. So here, 60% of cases are female. So more men tend to get this disorder. And the average age is much higher. So the average age for anorexia is, maybe around, late teens, even early teens. Average age for bulimia tends to be more in the 20s. Here it's 40, right? So older adults are experiencing, not older adults, but adults are experiencing this. And they share similar concerns about their shape and weight. They just don't engage in the compensatory behaviors. One other thing I'll say that is a controversy within the eating disorders field is whether you can have anorexia nervosa without being underweight. And the reason I say this is there are people who are maybe obese or overweight and lose weight so rapidly and really sort of get the same sort of obsession over losing weight. And they get the same physical symptoms. They'll start losing chunks of their hair. They'll develop osteoporosis, things along those lines, because you're not taking in enough nutrients, right? So as of right now, those people aren't technically diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, but I think they certainly would meet all the criteria, but the weight status one, right? So I think that that's important to keep in mind too. I'm not going to remember the exact quote, but there's a fantastic poet who writes about her experiences with eating disorders. And they say, if you're overweight and you have an eating disorder, you're celebrated. If you're underweight and you have an eating disorder, you go to inpatient care, right? So a lot of the things we prescribe for people who are overweight, if someone who was quote unquote normal weight or underweight did it, we would call an eating disorder. So I really think we need to analyze why we do that and why we expect that to be sustainable. So I spent a year of my grad school career doing pre-surgical evaluations for people going for bariatric surgery. So if you're not familiar with what that is, it's what they used to call like stomach stapling. So there's like gastric bypass, gastric banding, gastric sleeve. And those people had each been on at least 5 diets each in their lives. Sometimes the list was like 10 to 15. Every single one of them gained the weight back, and most of the time gained the weight back and more each time. We know diets aren't sustainable. We know, in fact, that diets can set off disordered eating behaviors in some people. And we know, in fact, that yo-yo dieting, that loss and gain, is actually more dangerous than staying at your weight status if you're overweight. So why do we keep pushing this? Honestly, capitalism is a big part of my idea, right? The weight loss industry is a several $billion a year industry. So there is something to be had there. Okay, so what causes eating disorders? We've kind of hinted at some of these things already. So most theorists here subscribe to a multidimensional risk perspective, and that there's several key factors that are risk factors. And the more you have in your life, the more likely you are to develop an eating disorder. And so the leading ones we'll talk about are sociocultural concerns like societal and family problems, psychological problems like mood disturbances, cognitive disturbances, and then biological factors. So for example, I don't think I have a particular slide about this, but there's a lot of great research coming out of Cynthia Bullock's lab at University of North Carolina, just 3 hours south in the Research Triangle, about how anorexia is genetic. And in fact, she's now doing a large-scale study about bulimia to try to identify genetic components of bulimia as well. All right, so societal pressures, and this is where I do most of my research. My research centers around risk and protective factors for body image disturbance and disordered eating. And so I have done a lot of this research. I'm in this world. Okay, so Western standards of female attractiveness and now also male attractiveness have contributed to the rise of eating disorders. Throughout history, standards have changed towards a thinner ideal. So when they did research from like the 50s to the 90s, Miss America contests declined in weight by about 1/4 pound a year, and the winners declined by over 1/3 pound a year. Even Playboy centerfolds had lower average weight, bust, and hip measurements than in the past. And so here is one of those studies, and you can see the downward trend, right? And here is one that they did, and you again could see maybe it was rebounding a little bit in the 90s. You know, and now Miss America is less of a thing, right? It still exists, I think, but it's not as much of like, it used to be kind of like Oscar night. Like a lot of people would watch Miss America, and now people are like, does that still exist? I love this meme. It kind of gets to the fact that people know this shiz, right? People know that the media has negative effects, and yet we're not doing anything to change it. So, you know, you've got the cat talking that the media portrays unrealistic body image ideals for the young felines of today. And one of my friends on internship loved that it was like a blonde, blue-eyed cat on the cover of the book. All right, and here becomes the problem, right? So the average model is about 5'9" and weighs 110 pounds, and that's a BMI of 16.3. That's in the underweight category. And research shows that people who are underweight are actually at many more health risks than people who are overweight. So kind of keep that in mind. The average woman is my height. She is thinner than I am, but still not stick thin. And her BMI is 24.3, which is on like the high edge of what is quote unquote normal. Little side note about BMI. If you're not familiar with BMI, that's called body mass index. And it is a sort of weight to height ratio with a weird formulation, like square, one of the things. We use it still in eating disorder research, even though we know it's problematic, just as sort of like a quick and dirty comparison, because we know it's related to body dissatisfaction. But in the 90s, it was like 97, one day the CDC just decided that they were going to adjust what the high end of average BMI was from like 29 down to 25, just because that was an easier number to remember. So a bunch of people who had previously been normal healthy weight woke up fat. Okay, so just sort of keep that in mind whenever you see figures about BMI, that it's completely arbitrary. All right, so we know that there are pressures in the media. They start from pretty young. Dove tried to, in the early 2000s, have like these body positive ads, women of a more diverse range of body types. If you notice, they all still do have sort of the hourglass shape. There's no one who's like an apple or a pear shape, right? And look at the tagline: curvy thighs, bigger bums, rounder stomach. What better way to test our firming range? So this is about, we'll celebrate you by trying to make you buy our product to look firmer. All right, and then Barbie. I know a lot of people played with Barbie growing up. I did too, right? But I also fully acknowledge that Barbie in some ways negatively affected me because I wanted to be blonde and blue-eyed. And when I wear the color yellow, I look jaundiced, so I can't imagine how bad I'd look with blonde hair, right? I don't know that I ever got obsessed about her body, but certainly you easily could. And so again, here are some stats about the average woman. And then if you compare to Barbie, it becomes pretty disturbing. So Barbie would be 7'2". So we're talking like Shaquille O'Neal height, but she would only weigh 101 pounds. Someone calculated this BMI for me once, and it's obscene how low it is. Like, she basically wouldn't be alive. And there's some other reasons I'll talk about why she wouldn't be alive either. She'd wear a size 4, mostly to accommodate her bust, which would be a double F cup. The average woman is about a B. Her head and her waist would be the same circumference. And then her shoe size would be a 5. So imagine someone with a women's 5 size shoe and Shaquille O'Neal's height, right? And Barbie's large bust size. So she actually would have to crawl on all 4s because she couldn't hold herself up. Her body would only have room for half a liver and a few inches of intestines, as opposed to the usual 26 feet. So the result would be chronic diarrhea and death from malabsorption and malnutrition. Her neck is twice as long as the average human's. And she wouldn't have enough body fat to menstruate, therefore she could never get pregnant. So a lot of really problematic things, right? Unhealthy. But again, I keep bringing back to this. People who identify as male also have pressures. They're just maybe slightly different. And so again, some of them will develop the traditional eating disorders, and in particular binge eating disorder. But there's also sort of a specific type of body dissatisfaction that becomes pathological that we see in men. And over the years, it's had many different names. They called it bigorexia or muscle dysmorphic disorder or reverse anorexia. And what they've come to is that this is now in the DSM-5 as body dysmorphic disorder. So what we talked about last chapter with muscle dysmorphia. Okay, so it's a specifier for BDD. And this is a controversy within our field, whether this should be classified as BDD or whether this should be classified as an eating disorder, because there's often problematic intake that goes along with it. But for now, this is what the field has decided on. So it's classified with the OCD and related disorders. Steroid use. Hang on. I have the definition for the DSM-5 that might be helpful. The individual is preoccupied with the idea that his or her body build is too small or insufficiently muscular. So these folks look in the mirror and think they're smaller than they are. And certainly women can develop this too, and there's actually more pressure on women now to be muscular. So steroid use can be a problem here. A colleague of mine, actually a friend from grad school, Brian Karazina, has done some research about what he calls the stepping stone theory, that you might start by just like using protein powder, no problem. And then you might like try creatine, maybe a problem, right? And then eventually you might actually be taking steroids. And anabolic steroids, when they're used for medical purposes, are fine. But just like with your diet, you shouldn't just start doing this stuff without the advice of a doctor, because it can have a lot of similar health consequences to what we saw with anorexia: heart issues, lung issues. And there are anecdotes about kids as young as 5th grade getting steroids from their coaches, right? Just mind-boggling. These folks will excessively exercise, and it tends to focus mostly on trying to gain muscle mass, so weightlifting. One of the dangers with steroid use and heavy weightlifting is your muscles can grow faster than your tendons can keep up. So sometimes they will get injuries where they actually snap a tendon and the muscle kind of rolls up on itself. They have body dissatisfaction. They'll engage in mirror checking up to 12 times a day. They'll put themselves on very strict diets, like only chicken and veggies, right? And sometimes really limiting their calories, or sometimes eating, way more calories. And they'll definitely engage with and compare to other men. And we see this just like with Barbie and boys' toys as well. So what you see here on your left is Luke Skywalker and Han Solo from the 70s when the movies first came out. And then on the right are their action figures from the 90s when the movies were re-released. And Mark Hamill, who plays Skywalker, actually said, "It looks like somebody gave my action figure steroids." Like, he was like, "I've never looked like this." G.I. Joe, similar, started out as just sort of your average Joe, right? And then over the years, he honestly developed muscle dysmorphia, probably, right? Like, this last guy, I think he is a villain, but like, right, like, not everyone can look like The Rock, and I think even The Rock's legs aren't that big. We also know that because of these societal pressures, certain groups are at greater risk. So these include people in the public eye, so models, actors, dancers, certain athletes. It'd be interesting to see, I haven't seen any research on it, but it'd be interesting to see if this is true of like social media stars, particularly Instagram models, TikTok folks. I would imagine it's happening there too. So about 9% of college athletes, and we tend to see it more in what we call the aesthetic-based sports. So things like gymnastics, even track and field, because you're supposed to be very svelte in the track side at least. Diving, that's a judged sport. Things along those lines. So I mentioned gymnastics, about 20% of gymnasts. And the rate of eating disorders is actually 20 times higher in professional ballet dancers. And as you can see, this widely varies depending on the sample, but maybe up to 40% of ballet dancers having some disorder. And then at the time, I think it was the late 90s that this study was done, up to 15% of student ballerinas. So if you're not familiar with the ballet world, if you are good enough and your parents have money enough, you go to a ballet school where like you'll do academics on the side, but most of your life is focused around school, around dancing. Those, about 15% of them may have anorexia. And so this is actually something that I did a project on while I was a senior in college. And so I looked at sort of the history of this. And if you look at when ballet really started to become its own art, women were much more curvaceous. But even at that time, they were portrayed as like supposed to be lighter than air. There was this idea that you're supposed to be like a sylph from mythology, but they still had this curvy figure. Then in the 1930s, we got more of a athletic body type. I would say this is closer to what we now see in like modern and contemporary dancers. So if anyone watches like So You Think You Can Dance or World of Dance, right? So some of this has changed since I did this project in the early 2000s, but some unfortunately has stayed about the same. So this is Gelsey Kirkland. She was a prima ballerina in the 70s, and you can just see how emaciated her body is. And I read her autobiography, and she did have anorexia, and she did use heroin to like get her, no, cocaine to get her through. And this is her when she was like healthier. But you can see even then, even though she might have some muscle tone, right? Problematic. And this was her idol, a Russian ballerina. And one of the things that really bothers me about this picture, in addition to her arms and her legs, right? But is the fact that her point shoe looks like it's too big for her foot. And anyone who's ever danced and worn point shoes, which I did growing up, knows that point shoe fit is one of the most important things so that you don't injure yourself, and it allows you to do all the movements, right? So, and so again, here's one of the student ballerinas. They'll talk about, you know, wanting this certain body type. You hear this in gymnasts too, the international line. They just mean being really skinny with long legs. And then this was from the early 2000s, and you can count her ribs here, right? So certainly, and I remember when I was doing this project, one of the male professors asked, well, don't ballerinas just have to be that thin? And as I'm opening my mouth to say no, one of my female professors leaned around me and said, no. And I was like, thanks, I got this. But no, in fact, they've got to be strong. And like the professor's argument was about lifts, but I, again, was a ballet kid, and my dad actually used to sort of help backstage when I did the Nutcracker, and he talked to one of the male ballerinas once, and he was like, how do you do all those lifts? And the guy's like, she does most of it. Like if she doesn't jump, she's not going up, right? You have to be strong. It's about weight sharing and things along those lines. And we know these start young. So two of my undergrad professors, Sarah Mernon and Linda Smolock, wrote this paper with actually two of their students, who I think were a year or two ahead of me at Kenyon. And they looked at elementary school kids and they showed them pictures of the celebrities. This was the early 2000s. So they showed them like Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera. And they asked them, what would you have to do to look like this? And the boys were really jokey. They'd be like, you'd have to lift the house. And the girls, and these were 1st through 5th grade girls, said, you'd have to not eat, or you'd have to eat and then throw up. So very young people recognize this. One of the cool things they did, though, is that the third author, Andy Mills, actually found two other Kenyon students, and they created a children's book called Shapesville that's actually not only awesome in and of itself, but has actually been validated in multiple studies now as a body image intervention in and of itself for young kids. So we have this book. We've read it to Quinn. She loves it. Shapeville. She'll ask for it. All right. So what are some of these other societal pressures? So this gets back to Charleston's question, right? In the past, were there economic and racial differences? Probably just based on who we were bothering to study, to be perfectly honest, right? Like, oh yeah, this is a white woman thing, but all of our samples are only white women. But we've recently been discovering that it exists among all socioeconomic statuses. That's what SES stands for, and ethnicities. And so there are certain cultures or ethnic subgroups, races like, Black individuals, Latinx individuals who argue like we have a much more curvaceous figure that we look up to. But like you look at Beyonce and she's still very slim, right? Yes, she's more athletic and muscular and she's amazing and Queen Bee, yes. But she's still very slender and a lot of Black women can't look like that, right? Same thing with Shakira, right? She's Latinx, she's amazing, but she's actually very petite and tiny and not necessarily that curvaceous, right? She's a song where she sings about her body related to that.
And also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm from Uruguay, so in South America, and I think there's a lot of pressure to, yes, be slim and have a tiny waist, but also have that like hourglass figure. And if you don't have that, it's like you're missing something. Like, oh, okay, so you're slim, but you have no shape. So that's kind of and it's almost impossible to do, because your body sometimes it's just not like that.
Right.
So you
and
have
to will have problems. So I had a friend in college who was very slim with a large bust, and she had to get surgery because she had back pain all the time. Right. So yeah, I think Ramina's bringing up a really good point, which is that it's nearly impossible for your body to just look like this. There's maybe 5% of the population where that's true, right? And other people either have to get waist trainers, which are really problematic, or, breast augmentation, things along those lines. And all those things carry their own risks. Yeah, that's a really, really good point, is that these are unrealistic body types for anyone, right? And so then we take and we kind of copy paste it to, you know, ethnicities or races where your body typically doesn't do that, right? It becomes even more problematic. Yeah. And then there is a socially accepted prejudice against overweight people. And if people don't believe me, you should talk to an obese person. Because when I was doing my interviews for those pre-surgical interviews, people would tell me stories about when they went to order dessert at a restaurant, the waitress telling them, "You don't need that." People on the street yelling out dieting tips to them or making comments about their weight. And so, of course, people don't want to be fat because we see how negatively fat people are treated in our society. And I'm using the word fat because actually people who are overweight / obese are sort of reappropriating that term right now, which is sort of interesting. And there's actually a whole subfield called fat studies. That's like an offshoot of psychology, but also women's studies. And so about half of elementary school girls and 61% of middle school girls are currently dieting. And it has been referred to as America's national pastime. And so the idea of a woman being slender is nothing short of a cultural obsession in America. And then this is now seen as analogous to beauty. There are also studies showing that if you're thin, you're more likely to get hired for a job, you're more likely to get a promotion. And then in 1989, Vincent said that obsession with fat is a national pastime. And then I have seen, and I can't track it back down, who actually said this, but my favorite description I've ever seen of Western society is that we are a bikini store next to a McDonald's, right? So we have very bizarre ideas about how we should present food. And then we expect people to, you know, be a certain way, look a certain way. This may be a phenomenon of Western culture, as I just hinted. One of my favorite studies about this came from Platt et al., and they looked at this in Old Order Amish. So if you're not familiar with folks who are Amish, they sort of live a more isolated life. They don't use electricity. They don't have access to TV or magazines, things like this. And so when they studied these individuals, young men and women, the same as in all these other studies we've looked at, showed no body dissatisfaction. And they were very accurate in their perceptions of their own bodies and those of other people's bodies. Whereas if you look at, say, even me and knowing all this, right, I would be inaccurate in how I perceive my own body. I would think it's bigger than it is. So it's not just living on American soil, right, because these folks live in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Virginia and other places. It is being immersed in media. And in fact, I don't have this on the slide, but one of the most telling articles about that was a study that was published in Fiji when Western media first got there. And before Western media first got there, they had like one thing that kind of looked like an eating disorder, but it was like a cultural based thing. And when Western media arrived, and this was when like 90210 was on and things like that, they immediately had a spike in the, what we think of as the traditional eating disorder, anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. So again, is it causal? We're getting closer to saying that, right? So exposure to media images of the thin ideal, of this unrealistic ideal. And again, for men, it is a thin, muscular ideal, although it's getting more for that for women too, right? Which again, going back to what Romina said, is even harder, right? To be slender, but also muscular, and may contribute to this normative body dissatisfaction. So one theory that I've looked at is called objectification theory, and Fredrickson and Roberts developed this at University of Michigan in the 90s. And the idea is that women are regarded as objects for consumption by society. If you look at advertising, women's bodies or parts of women's bodies are used to sell products. If you look at something as disturbing as the shootings in Atlanta a couple weeks ago, right? Those women were seen as disposable by that man, or like he was justified in killing them because of his sex addiction, right? as if it's their fault. So the idea here is that a woman's body is considered to represent the whole of her value rather than other aspects of her life. And eventually you get exposed to that enough and you internalize that. And they call that self-objectification, and it leads to all kinds of psychological problems. So not only disordered eating, but depression, sexual dysfunctions, things along those lines. So they did a really clever experiment to look at this. And so they had male and female participants come in, and they had them randomly assigned to either try on a swimsuit or a sweater. They told them this was like a consumer study. And then they were like, okay, so while you have that on, can you help us with this other experiment and take this math test? And they did it in a room with a mirror while they were wearing either the swimsuit or the sweater. And so women who were in the swimsuit scored significantly lower than women in the sweaters. Men in the swimsuit actually scored a little higher. And part of the reason for that is that the women reported high levels of body shame and reported feeling disgusted and angry when they had the swimsuit on, whereas men reported feeling sheepish or silly. Their feelings were more lighthearted. So for women trying on the swimsuit produced body shame and objectification, self-objectification, and that interfered with their concentration. Now, interestingly, I've seen this study replicated with guys, and when Fredrickson and Roberts did it, they had the guys try on board shorts. I've seen this replicated where they had the guys try on Speedos, and they had the same feelings as women. So maybe that's partially our culture changing to also objectify men, or maybe it was just the board shorts didn't get enough at really emphasizing their bodies. So I think it's always important to like look at what has happened after these types of things in science. All right, we know also that families play roles, particularly in anorexia. So as many as half of the families of those with eating disorders have a long history of emphasizing thinness, appearance, and dieting. Mothers of those with eating disorders are more likely to be dieters and perfectionistic themselves. We also see abnormal family interactions and communication. That could really set the stage for eating disorders. So Minuchin, who developed family therapy, described these as enmeshed family patterns, and that he said that these are causal factors of eating disorders. So these patterns include over-involvement in and over-concern about each other's lives within the family. The boundaries between the family members are weak and intrusive. And so refusal to eat, as we talked about earlier, can be seen as a way to gain independence as a result. We also know there are some biological things, as I mentioned. There's some large-scale genetic studies going on now to look at, which particular genes. Twin studies, as you see here, do seem to show that it is genetic, like 23% to 9% concordance rate is pretty big. Relatives of people with eating disorders are 6 times more likely to develop an eating disorder. And it's thought that these might be related to low serotonin, but that's somehow distinct from the low serotonin of depression. Although, as I mentioned previously, we also see depression, anxiety in these folks a lot. So people with bulimia show deficiencies in serotonin and norepinephrine. And people with anorexia show deficiency in hormones produced in the hypothalamus. However, is that causal or is that a result of starving themselves? Those are harder to pick apart. So this is that diet binge purge cycle I mentioned before, right? So they'll start with rigid dieting, and this can extend into fasting for as long as they can. They'll have some sort of slip. They eat something they don't think they should. They're bad foods. I hate calling foods good foods and bad foods for this reason. Foods aren't good and bad. They're just foods, right? They're just, some of them you can eat more often than others, right? And so they'll feel like, oh, I broke my rules. I violated this. So they'll just binge because they're like, well, screw it. And also because they're hungry, and also because they feel bad. And binging temporarily makes you feel this euphoria. So they feel completely out of control. They're done in secret. And after the binge is over, they'll feel guilt, remorse, disgust, have fear of weight gain. And then that will encourage them to purge. And then they'll feel okay for a little bit, but then be like, oh, I got to get back on track. And they'll go back to the rigid dieting. So how do we treat eating disorders? And we'll start this today and we'll finish this on Thursday. But there's actually a lot of great research that's been going on about what might work here. So the two main goals of eating disorder treatment in general are to correct those abnormal eating patterns and behaviors, but then also to address the broader psychological and situational factors that have led to and maintain that eating problem. And oftentimes, particularly if they're adolescents, this will require the participation of family and friends. So these disorders, from the cognitive behavioral approach, they talk about dysfunctional thoughts and experiences, things like selective abstraction, where you only focus on the food or your body and not anything else. Dichotomous reasoning, thinking in extremes and absolutes. There's good foods and bad foods. I'm either a great person when I'm dieting or a horrible person when I'm not. Overgeneralization, deriving a rule from one event and applying it to others. Again, one person says, hey, you look great since you lost weight. And you think that means I'll just look even better if I lose even more weight and more weight and more weight. And then magnification, exaggerating the significance of events. So you get teased or rejected.
For so long.
What's that? I think someone accidentally unmuted. And so they exaggerate the significance of those events. They build them up to be more than they are in their heads. So a big part of what we do here, as with some of the other disorders I've talked about, is education. So a lot of the stuff I've been telling you all about the psychological and physical effects can be really helpful. For perfectionistic people with anorexia, particularly those who are also driven in the area of academics, telling them their brain is getting smaller can be a really good motivator to start to make behavioral changes. Then you want to start to identify thoughts and feelings that support this either self-starvation or binge purge cycle, and challenge your dysfunctional thoughts. You want to problem solve what are other things you can do instead of binging and purging when you're feeling overwhelmed, and encourage behavioral change. So a big thing that we do, CBT, not surprisingly, given what I've already told you all throughout the semester, is what I did with most of my clients. A big part of what we did was try to get people to eat 3 meals and 3 snacks a day. So eating every 3 to 4 hours. And basically almost every prescribed diet for health I've seen goes along with this. So this is what I was told to do when I had gestational diabetes. This is what we told people recovering from anorexia. This is what we told people who were going to undergo bariatric surgery, right? So the idea is you are never going to let yourself get so hungry that you binge. And then also that you are teaching your body to recognize when it's hungry again. And so there are some great sort of offshoots of CBT that look at this. There's intuitive eating, which you may have heard of. There's appetite awareness training, which is a form of intuitive eating, where you just learn to listen to your body again because we've spent so much time not listening. All right, we will stop there and jump back into treatments on Thursday. And this is, again, always the time of the semester where I get a little behind because I get very excited about eating disorders. So if we need to, we can always move the exam by a day or so. So thank you all for asking great questions, making great comments, and I will see you all Thursday, and I'll hang around for a minute or two in case anyone has any questions.
Have an awesome day.
You too.
Have a good day.
Hi, I had a question.
Sure.
Okay, so I was talking to my advisor for recreational therapy yesterday about possibly minoring in psychology. So for my Psych 101, it's for my social science, but if I minored in psychology, would I have to find another social science class?
I think it's just you can't double count for your major. I don't think it's
Okay, because he couldn't remember if it was just for the major or for both.
almost positive it's just major.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll be glad
Have a good day.
you too.